All right. All right. Give me okay, here we go. Just give me 1 second and I'll be all yours. All right, I got it. All right. All
So the
right.
first, just so you know, the first question, I'll introduce you guys. I'll do like a little bio of a little bit of your bio. And then the first introduction, the first thing I'll ask you guys is to just, um, tell us more about what you do at your organizations. If there's any, programmatic things that you want to highlight, feel free to do that during that time. So we just have 2 to 3 minutes to do that, like we talked about before. And then we'll go into the discussion questions. All
Mhm.
right. So let's go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a very important and timely discussion on EVs Meet EJ, progress on energy and infrastructure justice. I'm Dr. Shelley Francis with EV Noir, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's panel. I am thrilled to be facilitating this conversation with our group of experts who are at the very forefront of making electric vehicles more accessible and equitable for all communities. So particularly those that have been historically been um, underrepresented in this sector. So as we explore the intersection of electric vehicles, energy justice, and infrastructure equity, we're going to focus on efforts that are being made to ensure that the benefits of multimodal electric vehicles such as cleaner air, cost saving, workforce and economic job opportunities reaches everyone, particularly the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by transportation emissions. So today we'll take a look at policies, programs, and technologies that are driving energy and infrastructure justice in the electric vehicle space. And we hope that today's conversation will provide insights and inspiration that will empower you to advocate for and implement equitable EV infrastructure in your own context. So, moving into the introduction of our esteemed panelists today, I want to introduce our panel of experts. We are joined by three distinguished experts who are making significant strides in advancing equitable EV infrastructure. First, I'm going to start with Antoine Thompson, and he is a nationally recognized leader in the environmental justice and urban policy space. Antoine is the executive director of the Greater Washington Region Clean Cities Coalition, where he champions clean transportation fuels to enhance both homeland security and promote diversity and inclusion. Antoine's extensive background in public service includes his time as a New York State Senator, where he authored the Green Jobs, Green New York Law. Then we have Brian Zepka, and he is the research manager for the Electric School Bus Initiative at the World Research Institute, WRI. And Brian is leading research activities to advance the equitable transition of the United States school bus fleet to electric by 2030. He has also worked with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on environmental health programs, and in his free time, he currently is pursuing his doctorate in environmental health at Johns Hopkins University. Next up, we have Yasmin Yacobi, and she is the Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Justice and Equity. Yasmin's work focuses on ensuring that all communities have access to clean, affordable, and dependable energy. And she's played a key on community benefit plans across the Department of Energy. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So before we jump into our discussion, I just want everybody to have a better understanding of what our distinguished panelists do in their specific roles. So I'm going to start off with Yasmin and let her tell you more about what she does. Then we will go to Brian and Antoine, and then we'll start our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis. It's an honor to be here with you all. Good afternoon, everybody. As Dr. Francis mentioned, my name is Yasmin, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Office of Energy, Justice, and Equity at DOE. The work that my office does is really focused on ensuring that all communities have access to the historical amounts of funding that are coming out of the Department of Energy right now. And specifically, the Office of Energy, Justice, and Equity was founded back in 1978. So we've been around for quite a long time with the same mission to ensure that underserved and overburdened communities have access to the resources that we put out and can benefit from the clean energy transition. As Dr. Francis also mentioned, I've been working extensively on community benefits plans and making sure that the ways that we are implementing the Justice 40 initiative and other presidential executive orders actually trickle down into communities. So I'm excited to be here with you all.
Thank you, Yasmin. Now, Brian, you are next up.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Francis. Thank you, everyone. I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. So my name is Brian Zepka. I'm a research manager at WRI's Electric School Bus Initiative. And Dr. Francis mentioned our mission, which is to build momentum toward an equitable transition of the entire US school bus fleet to electric. And in turn, we hope to bring health, climate, and economic benefits to children and families across the country, but then also normalize electric mobility for an entire generation. So to really get that momentum going. And so I am the research manager. I kind of manage research activities across our different focus areas. And when I say that, we kind of have 6 focus areas, and they are supporting school districts in accelerating the transition to electric school buses, collaborating with manufacturers across the electric school bus supply chain to prepare for that transition and making sure it's sustainable, working with electric utilities to improve interconnection and investments for electric school bus charging infrastructure. And we kind of go into supporting different rates and tariffs, which I can talk about more. Facilitating an understanding of electric school bus business models and promoting the expansion of funding and finance options within that market, engaging policymakers at the federal state level to reduce barriers, and then centering communities in pursuing school bus electrification, working with community organizations, and kind of making sure communities are engaged throughout that whole process. One of the more relevant research activities that we just published recently, which I'm hoping to talk about today, is we have a new report kind of looking at the geographic distribution of school buses, their fuel types, and their emissions control technology to understand which school districts and which populations are exposed to emissions from the oldest, most polluting school buses. And so we have found that those are in disadvantaged communities, but then conversely, in the early stages of the electric school bus transition, electric school buses are going to those communities primarily first. And so that's just something that I wanted to highlight. We just published that, and definitely happy to talk about that more as we go through the panel, but thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, Antoine, you're up next.
Well, let me first say thank you. Thank you to the university and you, Dr. Francis, for extending this invitation. Greatly appreciate it. Greater Washington Region Clean Cities Coalition. We are one of 100 clean city organizations that have been around for 31 years. We were one of the first to get started in the country back in 1993. And we have a big focus on clean energy, clean transportation, really looking at reducing greenhouse gases and emissions and its impact on communities, especially disadvantaged communities, and reducing our dependency on foreign oil as well. America's fought a lot of wars based on oil as well. But I've been with the organization, it'll be 3 years in November 1st, and seems like a lot longer, but been 3 years. and we're doing a lot of electrification projects and other clean energy and transportation projects. And the federal government, which we'll probably get into today about Justice 40. So there's a real doubling down on that focus on how do we connect the dots between investments in clean energy and clean transportation and reducing those public health consequences that disproportionately impact communities of color in a negative way. And just excited to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we're excited to have all of you here with us today. And again, we'd like to show much appreciation to Dr. Jacoby Wilson and his team for putting together this conference. And I think this is the 10-year anniversary of the conference. So I'm definitely excited to be here and this great discussion. So I want to pivot and start talking about what we're here to talk about today. Of course, it is equitable access to EV. So let's start off first by kind of level setting about the challenge questions to all panelists. And what would you say are the most significant barriers to equitable access to EV charging infrastructure? How can those barriers be effectively addressed? And who wants to start off first?
I can jump in. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because I keep getting some buffering or something. I didn't know if that was my computer or not. Um, so I would say just a few quick things. One is that we have to revisit the way EV chargers are deployed. I I think one of the immediate barriers is it's a market-driven model. Uh, the way companies decide where they're going to put chargers, much of that is dependent on when they look at where registrations are in the community and do some analysis and projections and to say whether or not it makes the business case to put chargers in the area. That model will put communities of color at a disadvantage, especially EJ areas. And we should have learned that from other technologies like the internet. And so I think the model of just looking at where electric vehicles are registered, it puts communities that really need EVs because of high rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses at a disadvantage. So that's why government supported foundation and private sector investments to make sure that we're doing um, deploying EV chargers and doing EV education, providing incentives to help people get electric vehicles in those areas I think, are extremely important. The last thing I would say is that, so much of our country, uh, our people live in communities where they don't have garages. And if, for example, in our region, you look at DC, you look at Montgomery County, and to some degree, Prince George's County, two major counties and one in the District of Columbia. Well over 40% of people in those counties in the district don't have garages. And especially that number just goes even up further when we talk about people who are in EJ areas. So we've got to get public policy moving forward in an aggressive way to offer curbside charging. We also need to reimagine our traditional gas stations. There's been like this push to just ignore that gas stations exist. If they don't make money, they're going to become the next major EJ problem because we're going to have a lot of dormant gas stations. And so our office is very concerned about making sure that we deal with gas stations in a traditional form and help the mom and pop gas stations offer EV charging and other cleaner low carbon fuels as well.
Yeah, I can jump in here. Thank you so much, Antoine. I want to give, Antoine just gave such a great overview of some of the direct issues that we have in EV infrastructure adoption. And I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the root causes here. I want to recognize very much so that the inequities that we see across the United States today in a lot of capacities within the energy sector and outside of the energy sector are a direct result of the systems and legacies that exist in the United States. The injustices that we've seen are not coincidental, right? The racial and economic disparities are a direct legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of redlining, and a myriad other government-sanctioned policies and systems. And so just as these policies were intended or were created intentionally, our efforts to undo their harm have to be intentional. When we look at data, we see that there is inequitable clean energy access, and it is often based on race and income. And a lot of those impacts are, again, a direct result of redlining, for example, that happened from 1934 until 1968 and decimated communities due to the lack of investment in those communities. And so as we're continuing to think about how to address some of these barriers, we first of all have to recognize that these barriers are systemic. And we then need to recognize that in order to undo some of this harm, we have to be intentional and targeted in reaching the specific communities who have suffered these inequities.
I have to double click on what you said, Yasmin, because I think that is so critically important that many times people forget, like as we're putting these wonderful policies and programs into place, you have to couple the policy investment with community engagement and education. And the engagement part is critically important for the very reasons that you just shared in terms of the historical inequities and disinvestment harmful in some practice or intentional. We don't like to say disadvantaged community, but communities that are disproportionately impacted by lack of access to clean water, to infrastructure, through transportation. So when we're looking at many of these issues around mobility, transportation, EV infrastructure, you have to look at these issues systemically and holistically and zoom out and look at, the communities where people live, work, play, and experience life. And so a lot of these factors are social determinants of health. So those are the factors that, as I was just saying, impact the way people live, live, work, play, die. And so understanding how your environment, how access to healthcare, how mobility, social economics, and demographics are impacting one's health and well-being is just so intertwined with access to mobility and infrastructure. And so we really need to think about how we're these different programs when we put infrastructure and policy in place. We first have to be having these conversations as the opportunities and how this technology or how this program or infrastructure is going to help them and help their community move ahead and advance. Wonderful. So just moving on, and before I go, did anyone else want to add anything?
I can add just a little bit from the school bus perspective. So my perspective is going to be very specific to electric school buses, but kind of like what was just discussed certainly carries over to the school systems within the United States as well. So the main barriers for electric school bus adoption are the high costs of electric school buses and then the high costs and timelines of the infrastructure upgrades that are needed, and specifically presenting a harder challenge for those underserved communities. And that is due to the history of discriminatory and racist policies in the US, leading to those transportation disparities, but then also disparities at the school level from funding and lack of investment and such. And so I can quickly kind of run through how these disparities would impact school districts specifically, and what are some of the barriers that we're seeing, because it is important because not all school districts can take advantage of the opportunities that are coming around, like other school districts. And so, yeah, so not all school districts have the same access to the financial resources due to segregation, school boundaries, and budget policies. And so a solution, what does that look like? It could mean certain districts should be prioritized in funding programs. And then, not all communities have, say, equal access to energy assets. And underinvestment in some parts of the grid means that those areas may require additional investments for electric school buses. And so we should consider how ESB charging infrastructure impacts the grid, may require more upgrades, and then how ESBs can maybe be used as kind of an emergency power source in some of these communities as well to add resilience. And then definitely not all workforce transitions will benefit all workers. So we need to work with those communities to make sure that workers from communities disproportionately suffering from air pollution and the like are kind of centered throughout the transition. Yeah, and all these things just want to guide our electric school bus adoption process, because the disparities that were discussed might mean that well-resourced, often predominantly white and higher income communities have the capacity to adopt electric school buses faster, when other communities could benefit more from the new technology. So definitely the price and those infrastructure prices and timelines are some of the main barriers we're seeing for underserved communities. I'm not sure if Dr. Francis is frozen or not, but
I think she might be. And so, ooh, did we get her back? Dr.
back.
Francis, are you back? Okay. Well, I think kind of to start to move us forward, I would personally love to hear of some local successful examples of policies or programs from you, Antoine, or from you, Brian, that have been promoting energy justice in the EV sector, particularly in those communities that have been historically marginalized and disinvested in.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. So just a couple things. So we're really excited about a project that we have been working on with EV Noir and Virginia Clean Cities and a number of the utilities, et cetera, for a couple of years now. It's the Mid-Atlantic Electrification Partnership and Project, where we're doing education outreach. We're deploying chargers in a lot of areas. And that has been a really a good success story of getting lots of EV chargers in the region. Still a long way to go. We've also been involved. We're leading a Equitable School Bus Academy, where we're training people not only in our region but across the country around the deployment of electric school buses. Believe it or not, often when people purchase the buses, they're not really planning and thinking about deployment and all those things on the front end that are necessary to have a equity at the center of that planning process, from procurement to where the routing through the training of the fleet staff and the drivers as well. So we're really pushing to make sure that equity is at the center of that, and that we don't just take the opinion of, well, we bought some electric police cars or fire trucks or shuttle buses or school buses or park enforcement cars. They're in our area, and as long as people are using them, we made a step in the right direction. So we got to really make sure that's baked in a more effective and measurable and quantifiable way as well. One other thing I would say and I think that's been really good for us over the last couple years, is really working to help communities access some of the bipartisan infrastructure law money and Inflation Reduction Act money. It's a lot of work doing that. There's over $5 billion for electric school buses alone. But a lot of our school districts don't have the resources, the time, and the capacity to be able to get those dollars. So staying with them, even the bigger school districts, they're understaffed, right? And so it's a lot of work going to help them get that money. We've been able to help well over $30 million or more, probably closer to 100 million, and just on electric school bus alone. And then we've also done a really good job of working with some of our local partners around the low emission, low to no emission grants from low no grants from the U.S. Department of Transportation. That's been an incredible amount of funding. Some in Virginia, Ramada was able to get over $100 million for electric transit buses, and Prince George's County last year and this year combined, well over $30 million to get transit buses. So we've been working with them, pushing them, making sure just because the funding applications are out there doesn't mean they have the team, the time to be able to get these applications. And then there's a lot of work that has to go in around planning, because I can't tell you how many times people have gotten these awards and school buses are and transit buses are sitting around. So there's a lot of work uh, beyond just helping them secure money. So I just want to share some of those successes: technical assistance, community education, staff development, professional development, but helping them get access to this money, I think has been really important.
Thank you for sharing those great examples about the different ways policy and programs are working to level the playing field, particularly from a federal perspective, all the way down to the local community, regional perspective. I want to further tap into that and double click on that and explore further by looking at the ways like the communities themselves can participate and tap into. I think you raised a really important point, Antoine, in terms of the capacity building aspect. With this monumental amount of funding that we've had available over the last couple of years, we're looking at a whole paradigm shift in the way communities engage and access resources. And many communities may not have the capacity to, compete at the level of some of these bigger box institutions that are used to applying for federal funding. It's not an easy process to navigate. But let's take a look at that further by further exploring the role of communities themselves. So we know that communities have the best understanding of their own needs, their own challenges. They know the historical context that their communities have faced. And so with that in mind, I'd like to just talk a little bit more about the role of communities and community-led initiatives. So community is center of this conversation. So how critical do you think is the role of community is in leading these initiatives? So how significant do you think the role is of communities in further shaping EV infrastructure programs? And, what are some of the standout examples that you might have of how and where this is working successfully?
Well, I can go ahead and jump in and say that communities who are closest to the problem often have the solution. And so engaging with communities is going to be absolutely critical at every single stage. Communities know what they need, they know what their struggles are, and we can look at data all day, sitting in wherever we are. I mean, I sit within the Department of Energy, and we try to get as close to communities as we can, but we often rely on data. But without disaggregating that data, without hearing direct experience from communities, we're often going to miss the problem. And so I think that community input is going to be absolutely critical. We have been deploying an unprecedented amount of technical assistance, trying to get to communities, trying to understand and share information and build the trust that has very rightfully been broken between communities and the government, but also help build more education around all of these technologies and all of the opportunities that exist. I'd be happy to speak at some point a little bit more about the capacity piece and capacity building with our upcoming regional energy democracy initiative based in the Gulf South of the United States. But before that, and before getting into that, I'd love to hear from Brian or Antoine about other kind of the importance of community engagement.
Yeah, I can jump. Oh.
Go ahead, Brian.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the electric school bus initiative is kind of a equity first, community first initiative. And actually kind of going back to the previous question, successful programs. I mean, we always talk about the Clean School Bus Program through the EPA, and that is basically like a result of advocacy efforts from many local community organizations and community efforts, bringing that to kind of like the national stage and getting that bill and that money passed. And then also, I wanted to highlight, I was talking about successful programs and how to kind of like bring in the historically marginalized communities, but the Clean School Bus Program does a good job of giving money to priority districts. And we were just crunching the numbers recently, and $3 billion has been given out so far, and 89% of the total funds went to priority districts, which means low income, rural, tribal school districts, and then 84% of all the awarded ESBs went to the priority districts. So that's definitely one way of equipping those communities with kind of the funding to get around some of those hurdles that we've been kind of discussing. But yeah, and then the community is going to be critical moving forward. We're seeing successes, but we kind of like need the community on board to continue the transition, especially kind of in the environment that we're seeing around the politicization of electric vehicles and the like. And so, we need the community on board, parents, PTAs, students, K through 12 students do a great job of educating the community, doing citizen science projects, looking at different air quality initiatives in their schools. And then even school boards are very important for this particular process in getting initiatives passed or brought up into the community's kind of like focus areas. So lots of community importance moving ahead.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm going to let you jump into, Antoine. One of the things that I'm hearing in terms of the engagement with communities are our experts. And so we should treat them as such. So you need to engage with a diverse sector of stakeholders because they can inform these processes. They have an experience and expertise to share. I know in the work that we facilitate, because we're a consultancy and we're working on multimodal electrification, but also thinking about inclusion and equity in these processes, for us, it's really critically important to have these conversations with diverse stakeholders. So whether it is the parent, legislator, utility, Mrs. Jones or Miss Rodriguez who live down the street, it's really important to just have the ear and hear from all these different people. So coupling these lived experiences with critical data and research is really, and for us has been a very effective and meaningful way to engage communities and share back the findings, with community partners to make sure that what they're sharing and what we're hearing is resonating with them. So Antoine, I want to pivot to you and let you jump in here on this one.
Sure, great. So one of the great things that's happening is the U.S. Department of Energy, through its Vehicle Technology Office, has created a national pilot with Clean Cities. Our office is one of those partners, and they've got about 40 communities across the country where people are out there working with organizations and community members, making them aware of some of the funding, and all of them have different angles in which they are approaching community engagement around this massive opportunity to make a difference in lives and in families. I would also say that one thing that we have done is a couple things that we have done and are continuing to do. One, we have an advisory board of community people that we meet with quarterly to engage them around environmental justice. We've created a Green Faith program where we're meeting with clergy across the region. It's a newer initiative, but we do have a couple pastors in our area, in our region, who are doing some consulting to engage churches as well. And so our Green Faith program is to help them get uh, jobs, investment in clean energy and EV infrastructure at their churches and in the communities around their church, and really being able just to listen to them and be a partner with them on moving the needle in their community has been extremely important. We also do a lot of community listening sessions. We started an initiative called EJ Coffee and Conversations. We all know about the EV Coffee and Conversations. We take EVs out, but we've taken it a step further at little coffee shops, bringing out vehicles as well, but also talking to them about environmental justice, and that has been an amazing opportunity to engage with rank and file members of the community that just want to see things done differently. I would also say one other good success um, last year and this year, we've done some forums with the Sierra Club in Prince George's County, for example. We're always looking to partner. In fact, I want to thank Dr. Francis. One of your folks was at our EV in the Parks event a few weeks ago at Watkins Park, a major regional park in Maryland. And we had a nice conversation. We had EVs out there. We talked about it. I was actually amazed at how much engagement that was on. We did some in District Heights, Maryland, which is the EJ area. We've been able to work with them around some EV planning, helping them. And then we have places like Forest Heights, and also working with Pepco, the utility for Maryland. They have been amazing with getting EV chargers into communities of Maryland. We need to get more support from them, from the Public Service Commission, to get more chargers in EJ areas in Maryland. But that program, Pepco, has done a phenomenal job of getting chargers in EJ areas based on some flexibility and support from the Maryland Public Service Commission. But we can't stop there. We've got to get more of those out, and that utility has done a good job, and we're doing everything we can to get them more access so they can get more chargers at all of our parks, all of our senior centers, all of our public libraries, all of our youth and senior centers, some of the public housing developments. We need access to chargers all over the place, especially at all these public and quasi-public facilities.
Antoine, what you just shared speaks to the beauty and the importance of having great public-private partnerships so that, we're not just relying on only the government funding or government entities to like make this program a success. We need to have partnership with the Sierra Club, the Senior Center, the sororities and fraternities, the business chambers, as well as existing EV owners and enthusiasts. Like one of the things that we're really excited about in terms of our programming, we have a whole organization that is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. So we have thousands of members across the United States as well as abroad who are our advocates, who are our mouthpieces, so to speak, on the ground and can really speak to normalizing what EV adoption looks like, both from like the personal transportation lens, but also talking about it from a multimodal lens. So thinking about e-bikes and scooters all the way up to, medium heavy duty transportation. So one of the things I want to do now is just to mix it up a little bit while we're having this great discussion. I want to start taking questions from the audience so that we can make sure we get to a more significant number of audience questions. So audience members, please start teeing up your questions in the chat or utilizing the question feature. But the first question I want to share with our panelists is from one of our audience members. And they said, I'm loving this discussion and the great work that you all are doing to move the needle. Thank you very much for that accolade. And then the question is, how are you ensuring that while you're making positive progress, that you're also not doing further harm? So how are you ensuring that while you're making positive progress through it, transitioning and accelerating equitable infrastructure, how are we making sure that we're not doing further harm? And who likes to start things off?
So I can kick it off from the federal perspective. Of course, our intention is never to further harm. Intentions do not always equal impact, but of course that is the intention. So through all of our funding opportunities, first of all, we are still adhering very much to the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And so any projects that might have environmental harm must do an environmental impact assessment and look at that harm. And that environmental impact assessment is public, and groups are able to look at it and see whether a project coming into their community might cause harm. And if it is, they're able to get in touch with the applicant, the developer, or with the government to say, hey, watch out, this is happening in my community. The other thing that we've started implementing, I mean, we've talked a lot already about all of the insane amount of funding that is coming to federal agencies and flowing down. The Department of Energy, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, has received over $100 billion in investments to further the clean energy transition. And one of the requirements that we have for all of that money are community benefits plans. So community benefits plans are a new requirement, again, for all of this funding that account for 20% of the application for all funding opportunities. And so it's a big chunk of the application. And what we're asking is for applicants to this funding to speak to how they're actually going to ensure benefits to communities. We're also asking them to speak to potential harms. And so there are multiple avenues where we are asking for kind of flags about any potential impacts that might happen to communities to ensure that we are being not only equitable, but really thoughtful and proactive about our approaches. And community benefits plans, I can speak for days about those and about what they entail and why they're so important. But I want to make sure that I'm responsive to the questions, so I'll pause there.
Yes, and thank you for that and for sharing what the federal government or from the federal perspective, what you all are doing to minimize or mitigate potential harm. Anybody else want to speak to what they may be doing within their specific programs or roles to make sure that you're mitigating impact? I have a thought that I want to share in terms of addressing that, but I want to make sure that obviously Brian and to Antoine, that you also have an opportunity to share from your experiences as well. So one of the things that I learned from, working with our team in this space is that as many of you shared, just having those, being intentional in terms of engagement with our different stakeholder audiences. So we have relationships with stakeholders all across the country. So before there's even a funding opportunity or talk about infrastructure coming into the community, we've built relationships with different stakeholder groups so that we have an understanding of what their pain points are and what the opportunities are around mobility and access. And so for us, being able to have that relationship, as well as when we're doing work in communities or with clients around mobility and transportation issues, we are intentional in terms of sharing findings back so that they know like we've completed the whole circle in terms of this conversation. And we're going to them frequently and often with updates or with status updates of programs and potential opportunities so that they're not just hearing from us when there's a funding opportunity or there's some event happening, that we actually have a relationship and it's an ongoing, mutually beneficial relationship.
I'll jump in on the next one. I would say, and those are some very excellent points. A couple of things that I think that are really important from our office. We are really looking at this from about 4 different angles. One is about deployment, and making sure that's done equitably, and pushing both public and private entities to make sure that charging is there. We've got a lot of work to do with dealerships, both new and used car dealerships, fleet vehicles. We've got a lot of work to do with that to make sure that they're doing their part. Um, the issue around growing capacity is extremely important. We want to see more businesses in the area. We're concerned about all the health and outcomes as it relates to the impact of bad transportation policies on lives. So we want deployment, but we also want to make sure that communities of color and EJ communities are not just spectators as these investments are being made. They need to be the ones installing, the planning, the consultants, the vendors, the landscapers, the contractors that are the developers that are in this area, making sure they're part of that. The other thing I think that what we really push on extremely hard is um, telling the story, right? There's a people don't like talking about it, but there's a lot of distrust in communities of color around this issue. People care about it, they want to do it, but three things that I always kind of tongue in cheek about. Politicians are driving this. They're one of the most, and I've been a former state senator and a city council member, but politicians are often, people are skeptical about what they do. Then we got car salespeople, right? Another unpopular profession, but we need them, right? And the third one is utilities, right? So these are three entities that are paramount to this process that people are often skeptical. So that's why we need strong, trusted community partners that can talk about the importance of it, the benefits of it, keep the interest of the community first. And so we're working really aggressively on those particular issues and meeting people where they are, whether it's National Night Out, whether it's the Juneteenth Festival, whether it's a Labor Day parade, whether it's going to their tenant council meeting or their neighborhood association meeting or civic association meeting, talking with them, being on social media as well, and really helping to tell that story about the urgency to do this. Because less than 10% of people across the country, especially in our area as well, don't have EVs, there's a lot of community education that's needed. And that trust factor is critical because, a lot of times folks say, in Black and brown communities, we have all the problems, but our utilities, when power goes out, they come on last. So we got to be able to address that issue and talk about, well, if you get an EV, maybe you can get one that where you can have vehicle to grid that you can, in the event of a power outage, you might be able to keep your power on. So we had that conversation with people in the community. Those are just a few things I just wanted to share that I think that are really important as we talk about high touch, high engagement, building trust, overcoming fears, overcoming distrust, and helping people understand that this is good and great for them. And getting EVs there doesn't mean they're going to get displaced as well.
I think those are such critical and such important points that you raised, Antoine. It's really about just meeting people where they are and understanding like where they're coming to this conversation or to this space around mobility and transportation from. Is it a fear or distrust or lack of knowledge and understanding? Is it because like I don't have a personal vehicle, so I don't understand how this might benefit me? Or like I don't need a car, but I do need a job. And of course, there's good paying job opportunities within the EV or e-mobility space that we need to talk more about and also train the next generation of workforce. That's one of the things that resonates with us because we started a whole e-mobility fellowship program and now have about 20 different historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, Native and tribal partners, community colleges, trade and technical schools, because we know it's really important to reach underserved communities and educate them, equip them to be competitive for job opportunities in this space. And so we also want folks to help design the policies and the programs and the pilots that are going to be deployed to both general consumers, but also to communities who have been disproportionately impacted by transportation emissions. And one of the great ways to get more information about EVs is through programming. There's a really great opportunity coming up, National Driver Electric Week, in about another week or so. And so it's a 10-day program, a national campaign. Our sister organization, EV Hybrid Noir, is one of the 4 national organizing partners. And it's the largest global EV campaign. And there's opportunities to attend events in your community. So we'll put the link to that website in the chat so that you can go on there and put your zip code in and see what National Drive Electric Week programs are happening in your communities. at these events, you get the opportunities to essentially learn about test drive, feel, touch, and experience all different types of electric vehicles. So from scooters and e-bikes to personal vehicles to transit buses, school buses, and more. So it's definitely a really wonderful opportunity to learn more about the technology, see it, talk to people who are driving these vehicles. You can just learn more, be an educated consumer. So definitely we want to make sure that you are tapped into that. Another point, audience members, please continue to keep your questions going so that we can make sure we address that. Since we're talking about technology and innovation and education, I want to talk a little bit more about, what are some of those innovative technologies or solutions that may have emerged more recently that support the goal of equitable access to EVs, and how are those technologies being implemented from what you've seen? And so, Antoine, I know in your world, you work with a lot of different, you know, uh, clean transportation partners, and maybe you could speak to some of the things and the innovation that you guys are seeing or that you've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, one of the things that we're really excited about, that I think that's moving fast, but we still have some ways to. One is the cost that's driving up the price of vehicles. Hopefully, over the next 24 months, that will stabilize and begin to come down and start to come down, but not at the pace that I think it should. Uh, I think the big thing is around getting EV chargers more readily available. There's a number of federal grants. I know we're participating on one around charger reliability. That's very significant because we have what we call charging deserts now. And so that means that in many areas, people don't have access to charge vehicles, and it creates this fear that they're going to run out of charge for their car and not be able to do that, to be able to get to their next destination, or get have or their car get have to abandon their vehicle. I think that getting more chargers out there, making sure they're reliable. But I think the third thing that's really important is looking at the ability to see chargers charge faster, right? So we have a lot of vendors every day trying to pitch us on everything. So everything from the companies that want to put charging in light poles, which I think is a very good idea, to companies that offer charging where it does not have to be plugged into the grid, so they can do off-grid charging. Companies like Spark Charge and other companies like ePioneer, eBoost, Pioneer Mobility, where they can use all different technologies to get fast charging available. Or if someone runs out of a charge, where they can do that. Reason why some of these technologies are really important, because the time that it takes for the utilities to put a new charger in the ground um, can be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, right? Depending on how many charging stations they're going to have for the big, DC fast chargers that can charge your car 15 to 30 minutes. I think that's too slow, right? I think of my wife, you know, who we've got real life challenges in EJ areas, right? And uh 15, 30 minutes in some of these areas is just not enough, even in safe areas. So not everyone's going to be able to charge at home. And then when they do charge away from home, I like to see it faster. So there's a couple chargers are out there that are now around 7 minutes. There's a company called Gravity out of New York City that can charge in 7 minutes. But I want to see the charging where it's comparable, and even more so faster than a chase it is for a gas powered vehicle. So there's a lot of charging out there. There's the EV charging where you can drive down the road, right, and it charges your car. NASA has one. Our uh, space organization came up with a 7-minute charger too. I think it's 7 to 8 minutes. It's not on the market yet, but overseas they have a number of, in Europe, a number of different chargers, and so does China. I think the race is on for the United States to continue to innovate. And we've got to also make sure that local, state, and private sector entities are supplementing the large federal investments, because the federal money alone will not get us the type of technology and the access to infrastructure for EV charging that we need. It was a stimulus. It was designed to stimulate investment in the market, but the market, the private sector, local, state, and federal governments got to do a little more as well, beyond all the politicians, not all of them, but too many. Say, oh, we got all this federal money. This is great. We're going to do everything. That money's been spent 20 times over, right? And so we got to get faster chargers, support the folks who were really trying to make this a reality.
Yeah, I want to just echo a lot of what Antoine just said, and kind of double down on a couple of those points. But specifically, according to a National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL report, EV adoption is continuing to scale up, but up to 25% of EV drivers won't have at-home charging. And again, like Antoine said, it's not necessarily going to be realistic for everybody to have at-home charging. But as this EV adoption continues to grow, we'll need to invest and innovate in tech-enabled solutions like managed charging or reservation systems, curb management, all of those kinds of things to ensure that public charging can grow at scale. But then the other point that I wanted to make was that there was a study from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics in 2021 that showed that 52% of all trips, including all modes of transportation for passenger trips, for freight and good movement, and for the first and last mile, like multimodal connections, were less than 3 miles, with about 28% of those trips being less than 1 mile. And so these short trips kind of continue to further the need for electric micro mobility, like e-bikes and e-scooters and things like that, that can provide equitable zero emission mobility access at considerably lower costs for all households, but specifically in dense urban environments where trips are shorter distances and there is kind of protected street infrastructure to support safe riding.
Yeah, and I can add something we're watching. Those are great examples. We're specifically looking at something that's kind of in its early stages, is vehicle to everything, or V to G, V to X, as people call it. And for those that don't know, this is kind of a technology concept in which an electric vehicle is viewed as a mobile battery, and then the stored energy in the vehicle can be discharged for some other type of benefit. And then why school buses and why those are like good options is because they have these very predictable operating schedules. They operate in the morning and in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, and just during the school year. And so they're available during the evening or in the summers and kind of feed energy back during high demand periods, summer season. And then they have, fairly large batteries that provide plenty of usable capacity for different V to X or V to G services, and kind of like what that can mean for communities, which is important, is kind of like grid flexibility. There can be opportunities for, say, compensation, and emergency preparedness is something that's really important. So in times of an emergency, there may be an electric utility power outage or the power disconnects, but then the V to X services can provide that backup energy for shelters, homes, and other locations. And then even in the schools, if that's being used as a shelter, say, for example. And so, yeah, so that's something that we're watching. There's definitely lots of pilot programs that are happening around communities in the country, but that is certainly a technology that kind of is well suited for electric school buses.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. I think what you, and your colleagues shared is so important in terms of just thinking about different benefits in terms of different ways that we can utilize e-mobility, electric vehicles, and that spans from the e-bike and scooter world all the way up. And so there's so many different case uses for utilizing the technology, but I think that also speaks to understanding your end user, understanding the community's needs around mobility. So having like a mobility strategy, a mobility and electrification plan can be critically helpful to being able to identify in terms of like what makes the most sense, or what use cases makes the most sense for X and Y communities. Speaking in terms of community, I want to focus on a specific community that sometimes we don't often bring into these conversations around electrification, and that's more rural communities. And so one of the things that I wanted to just ask our panel of experts, Brian, I'll start with you first, is just understanding, in terms of thinking about rural electrification and EV infrastructure, what are some of the private-public partnerships that you've seen work, particularly in the school bus case, because obviously a lot of school bus districts, particularly in rural communities, are embracing electric school buses, which is really exciting to see. So would love to hear what has been your experience in terms of working with rural communities around these conversations about, electric school bus deployment, as well as EV infrastructure deployment that complements the rollout of the buses.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great one. There's lots to think about in rural communities. I mean, one, many times an electric school bus may be the first introduction to electric vehicles in a rural community. And so you have to be very thoughtful about implementing that new technology and what that can mean. And then, like many communities, rural communities have unique kind of, say, challenges and issues in terms of, say, the disproportionate impacts. And so, students living in rural districts kind of have twice as long of commutes as students in other communities. So that means more exposure to air pollution, more exposure to the emissions while they're riding the buses. And then they're also more dependent on school buses than other communities. So say for an urban area, some students may take the subway, but that's not an option in rural communities. So this is like the sole method of transportation. So again, have to be very thoughtful, because I guess moving back to question about preventing harm, we recognize the intersection that there is a great opportunity with electric school buses, but then there's also a risk. And so you don't want to take away or alter any type of transportation schedule when people are so dependent upon it in the community. So those are some of the equity challenges that we are thinking about. And then conversely, the solutions, though, I mean, V2X, which I just described, is a great opportunity for rural communities, providing that new source of energy, and then kind of like bringing in the location of an electric school bus depot or a charging station in a rural community could support different economic and educational opportunities that would be new to that community. And then in terms of public-private partnerships, I think one thing we're seeing is that, the electric school bus adoption process is very unique in that it's kind of a very high cost for school districts, which is the specific organization within the community. And so there's lots of different business models and private partnerships that could help school districts with private organizations at different steps of the process, which could help mitigate some of those barriers seen in the community. So a school district may, for example, own some of their buses, but then have a private partnership for the charger owner who can kind of like take that load off of the school district and kind of give them back some of their capacity. Or they could partner with kind of like a private organization that has transportation just as a service. And so that partnership handles kind of all the school buses and is basically taking care of the charging, infrastructure build out, and acquiring funds to get those electric school buses in the community. So that is one example of just kind of like partnering with private organizations to decrease the load and increase the capacity of the school district, because they are always kind of like fighting those different competing priorities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian, for sharing that. I would probably add in some of the work that we've done in rural communities has been just working to help build capacities. First, letting them know that these funding opportunities are out there and available. So like the New Era funding has like 7.3 billion that was deployed specifically to help rural communities transition and be prepared for electrification. So some of that funding has been allocated to 16 cooperatives in rural areas across 23 states, and they're doing projects like grid management pilots, Vita Grid, pilots, just looking at ways to basically enhance their infrastructure to prepare them for accelerating EV adoption. Of course, there's community fueling and community charging, fueling, and infrastructure dollars. So CFI money that is being earmarked for both urban as well as rural communities to help deploy infrastructure and address charging gaps. And then you can couple that, of course, with NEVI dollars to help build out the corridor infrastructure. So kind of coupling the corridor infrastructure with CFI money, as well as obviously some of the other mechanisms that we talked about, low-no dollars for transit buses and DERA money through EPA, DOT for school bus electrification efforts. I think it's also really important to work with those different community stakeholders, whether you're in an urban community or a rural community, to understand what their mobility needs and gaps are. One of the things that we know from research and data is that rural community members are driving further distances between 2 points. And so fortunately, now there are a lot more EVs that can have the capacity to meet their needs in terms of the potential range anxiety issues. But then obviously the other piece is charging infrastructure. So, working with the different cooperatives, for instance, or utilities. Antoine gave a number of examples of partnership with utilities, as did Brian. And so there's just a number of different ways that we can really try to work collaboratively to address rural electrification. But at the crux, it's really going back to education, outreach, and engagement in showing people that, hey, there's a whole fleet of different types of electric pickup trucks. If you need this case use for being in a rural community or say living on a reservation, there's 200 plus EVs available in the United States that can help meet your needs. And there's different rebates and incentives offered through both the federal government as well as locally and through utilities, as well as through various state entities, that residents and consumers may be able to stack those incentives to make the cost of EVs even more affordable for them. So I know we have a few minutes left. I want to take a few other questions. One of the questions that we just received in the chat was about critical mineral sourcing. And so the question is, how do you think we can balance the EJ implications of critical minerals needed for EVs and infrastructure, especially in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, with a need to reduce transportation emissions? So it's very infrequently that we're moderating panels or on panels where this issue about critical mineral sourcing does not come up. So any thoughts on how we can address this issue around the critical minerals and sourcing for EVs and EV technology? And really, it's not just for EVs. We use those critical minerals in computers and in our cell phones. So I think sometimes people forget that we also use those critical minerals in a lot of other technology as well. But love to hear your thoughts about this.
I think that's, it's something that definitely is a concern. That's a issue that hearing more and more of. I think it's another barrier for adoption for certain population groups as well. I'm also concerned about some of the particular minerals uh, that are involved with EVs, the shelf life of them, right? So we've got some of the key minerals that are projected to run out in 20 years at the time when we're trying to get over 75% adoption in the US. There are a lot of smart people that are trying to figure this out. I think the Department of Energy and others are funding a lot of research A lot of private universities and research institutions from both the public and private sector are working on this issue. I think it's extremely important. One thing that I do not want to see happen uh, is that we replace the dependency on foreign oil, right, for a dependency on minerals for electric vehicles, right? I don't want us to get to a point where we're fighting wars over the minerals for electric cars the same way we fought wars for uh, combustion engines, and that's within the realm of possibility if we're not intentional, if we don't get serious about innovation. So I wanted to share that with you. Clean cities, that's been like at the heart of our message, both under Democratic and Republican administrations for over 30 years. And that's something I'm concerned about as we move forward with electric vehicles, that we innovate in such a way that these precious minerals that are limited in nature, and many of them that we have to go overseas and developing countries, and China is, they're in South America, they're in Africa, trying to get as much of these minerals as possible, and so is Russia. So hopefully we don't get into a situation where we're going to war for these minerals the same way we have done for gasoline and oil.
Yeah, I can add just a little bit, and I think Antoine really summed it up very effectively. But yes, the Department of Energy really does have a lot of investment going into research right now around critical minerals, and specifically, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act, we're trying to bring a lot of these supply chains back to the U.S. And to have that reliance be here at home. And with that, and given that these investments are happening under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, they are subject to community benefits plans and the Justice 40 initiative. And so we are trying to make sure that in applications that are coming through, that there are really robust benefits around Justice 40, around good jobs, around workforce and community engagement, around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in these proposals and eventually in the actual projects themselves. And so this work is being undergone. I mean, I think that it's going to be really hard to balance, as the question says, the EJ implications and with the need to reduce transportation emissions. It's a bit of a tricky situation. But I think that it's really critical to recognize that critical minerals are critical. We really do need them, not just for electric vehicles, but like Dr. Francis said, for everything. I mean, I think there are something like 27 critical minerals in your cell phone. So we will need to kind of continue to innovate and think critically about how we ensure that communities benefit really meaningfully from the extraction that we need to do in order to further the clean energy transition.
Thank you. And I want to just tap into and just add that I think another key approach is, as Jasmine said, one of the things that is happening that is a lot of OEMs are actually bringing in some of that mineral sourcing and battery manufacturing. They're doing that in-house to better manage the supply chain. But I think there's opportunities to obviously recycle batteries and recycle the critical minerals that we're utilizing. So we're having like a kind of a circular chain in terms of thinking about like reusing the battery technology. So when the battery may be, you take the battery out of an old Nissan Leaf, we can use that for battery storage, or we can use that for something else. So just thinking, I'm being intentional in terms of looking at the utilizing that full life of the battery. And then also, obviously looking at corporations are looking to adopt and enforce fairer labor practices and investing in local communities and really try to minimize environmental degradation. So it's definitely something I think that people are looking at and as part of this conversation. So in our last minute that we have, if you wanted to just give a couple of takeaway points for folks to walk away with in terms of accelerating equitable access to EV infrastructure, what would you say in like 10 to 15 seconds would be like your best piece of advice? So I will start with you, Brian.
In the electric school bus space, best piece of advice would be to prioritize those communities most affected by the disproportionate burden of air pollution and the historical barriers that we've discussed. And then I guess circling back to my introduction, we just released that report finding that the oldest buses, those are the most polluting, the most harmful, are in those communities. And so prioritizing replacing those first. And I think I'll leave you with that.
Awesome. Thank you. And it looks like our time is up, folks. But
Oh no.
you had the closing word, Brian. So thank you all for your sharing your time and your expertise with us today. Thank you to the attendees for being so engaged and sharing your questions and giving us your attention. And then thank you to the CEJA and to the University of Maryland team for hosting this amazing conference. And I would encourage you to tune in and check out the rest of the virtual conference, as well as the in-person meetings if you're in the DMV, DC, Maryland, Northern Virginia area. So thank you again. And thank you to Eli, who was our tech support, who did an amazing job. So you guys have a great day and check out National Drive Electric Week and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.